I must confess that I was not very aware of my family background. What little I know about my family was later, especially on my father's side. I didn't really know very much. Only recently was my wife, who's a historian, who basically found a lot of materials which basically traces my father's side back to the sometime at least 19th century and possibly even to the late 18th century. Now, on my mother's side, I was quite aware, partly because I had much more contact with her relatives, and on my mother's side, I think she had moved to Penang after marrying my father. But basically, she grew up in Singapore. Had her lung collapsed when she was 14 because of tuberculosis, because her father had died when she was 5 years old. So there wasn't enough money and so on and so forth. But in those days, they didn't know how to treat tuberculosis, so they collapsed the lung. And so she was moved to study, to do medicine, but it was very difficult in those days because women were not supposed to study medicine. So almost all women who studied medicine who had come from the Malayan schooling system then, women basically were only taught to go into the arts stream. You couldn't go into the science stream. So invariably people failed. Siti Hasma failed a couple of times, and lots of other women basically failed because they were thrown in at the deep end of the pool. Then, right after she started, I think she had to repeat some papers and so on and so forth. And then the Japanese invaded, and famously, there wasn't much of a defense against the Japanese. I recently learned that one of her brothers, who had gone to study, gone to work in Taiping, went underground, and but this is a recent revelation, not something I grew up with. But I still remember talking, for example, to somebody who used to be a gardener nearby, who would tell me stories about how he went into the and fought with the anti-Japanese army and so on. So it's those memories were still strong. In Penang, there was less of a sense of the emergency, or at least people didn't talk to me very much about it. And so I was lucky enough by that time, my parents could afford to put me in some kind of kindergarten, partly because my mother had to work, and so I went to a Chinese language kindergarten. Had a lot of problems, children's racism, if you can put it that way. And so I had to leave one kindergarten and go to another one. And then eventually I went to school. No, my mother never finished. She started medical school, but basically the war, yeah. So basically she had to start supporting the first, yeah. And she was on the last ship, because by the time the war began, she was already 22. And she was on the last ship which left Singapore without getting sunk. There was a ship after hers which went through the Straits of Malacca and was sunk by the Japanese. But her ship went down to Sunda, and from Sunda it went up to Colombo. They were not allowed to land in Colombo for various reasons I don't understand. And then she moved to, but they finally ended up in Bombay, which was probably, it was quite far away from the Bay of Bengal. And so she spent the war in Bombay. and first met my father there then, but she had probably some kind of interest with somebody went from medical school. But after the war, all that ended, and so she and my father was courting her. So that's how things began. No, my father is from Penang, but he was in technical college, and from technical college he wanted to go further, and went to study in India. But the war had begun, so he studied. He eventually joined the Royal Navy Reserve. So he was very lucky. He actually had what do you call it? A rank. He was an officer in the Royal Navy Reserve. And towards the end of the war, the British were quite desperate for. So what we have normally is this image of the war being fought by white men, and so on. In fact, there were more people from India who were recruited, and he went to like a Marine, so to speak. It was basically in North Africa. So from North Africa, they moved into Europe, and then by the time the war ended, at the beginning of the European summer, his work was done, and then he came back to this part of the world and was involved in the supposed liberation of Bali. So I have some very poor quality black and white pictures of Bali right after the war. And so on. And then he went back to Penang, first to Singapore, and then met my mother again, and so on, and then eventually moved to Penang. And in Penang, he was quite one of his classmates was Lim Chong Yu, who had Chong Yu had basically Chong Yu's minister. Chong Yu was working for the Kuomintang war minister, who had broken with Chiang Kai-shek, and Chiang Kai-shek wanted to wage the civil war. The war minister said, no, let us maintain the united front, the anti-Japanese united front. And so it's not very clear, but basically after the end of death of Roosevelt, many things happened, and so the war minister lost out, although he was actually quite powerful. And Chong Yu went back to Penang, and together with some of his friends, he formed something called the Radical Party. But the party never really took off. It was slightly parochial, and a bunch of Chong Yu and friends. My father never got involved with that, but I think, I honestly don't quite know. He had a couple of business schemes, but basically the schemes failed. And he was largely an NGI, so he was involved in what the Americans would call veterans movement. In this part of the world, it was called the ex-servicemen's movement. He had been invited to the Victory Parade in London. And when he went to London, he got to London early, even though he went by ship. But then Britain was devastated. There was no money in Britain, and it was a cold winter. There was very little heating and so on. And so what happened was that they postponed the Victory Parade to the following year, to 1946. So it gave him an extra, because he was an officer in the British Royal Navy and so on, they gave him, basically let him do his own thing. And he attended the Pan-African Congress, which was organized by Kwame Nkrumah. And there he was quite impressed by Nkrumah and so on. And yes, but I would probably have been known as Kwame rather than, which is a misnomer, because Kwame actually means Saturday born, and I'm actually Thursday born. So under the naming system, I would be a Yao. But anyway, my father probably didn't know what Kwame meant. My mother eventually supported the family after my, she actually worked for a company which, among other things, imported pharmaceutical drugs from the UK. And so by the 1950s, I guess arguably when I was a very young person, she was, I learned much later that she was actually supplying drugs to doctors all over the northwest part of Malaysia.
How many siblings did you have?
None.
Yeah.
Yeah. My mother lost a daughter probably in a miscarriage, and so it was not easy to have a child after that. And after I was born, she did. I don't think they tried again. Well, Penang was still, like a bit, it wasn't physically very developed. So the bus system didn't really exist. It was a tram system. So there were electric trams. From the point of view today, it would be considered ecologically much better. And I lived in a brickfields-like neighborhood. Brickfields in KL is known for having a whole series of religious institutions. There are all kinds of churches on Jalan Sultan Abdul Samad. There is the Malaysian Buddhist Association. There are, next to each other, there are, I think, 4 different Hindu temples, including one to Hanuman, and the last one being the Shivite temple. Well, it's not known as such, but just to give you a sense of the geography of the area, there's a road called Burma Road, and shows you the significance of the Burma connection in those days. And off Burma Road, there were all kinds of roads like Rangoon Road, Tavoy Close, Moulmein Road, and so on and so forth. So this was that was one bound, and then crossing it was a road called Pangkor Road, and then there was another road, the longest road in the city, called Perak Road. So I lived on Perak Road, number 3 Perak Road, and facing Perak Road were 2 Buddhist temples, 2 completely different conceptions of the Buddha. On the one hand, you had the Thai Buddha sitting lotus position, and so on and so forth. And then next to that, there was the Chinese Buddhist temple, big, fat, jolly, with hands sort of on the, kind of obese version of the Buddha. And I remember when I was coming back on a holiday later, many years in 2019, I was stuck in Lahore, in southern Pakistan, and I went to the Lahore Museum, which is really an incredible museum, because Mohenjo-daro collection is there and so on. And there are all these different depictions of the Buddha, bodhisattvas and so on, and as well. And the Buddha there, many of them were basically very ascetic. You could count the ribs. Was that kind. So here you have 3 different conceptions of the Buddha, and you begin to think about the different kinds of values. So it's not good enough to say Buddhist values. It depends on how that Buddhism is viewed and interpreted. And then down the road, there was the first girls' school, Al Mashor Girls' School for Muslim girls. And the girls would walk by my house. Those who were day students would walk by every day. And then behind me there was a vicarage, and across from the vicarage was a statue of Empress Victoria. I remember I would look at this statue because I used to play in that field very often, and I thought, this is kind of a shrunken version of a queen. But it later turned out that she was a very short person, But I remember for many, many years thinking that, it was a shrunken version. And then you had, various other sort of semi-religious. And every day when I was walking to school later, I would pass, for example, the home of a Sindhi lawyer, Sir Hussein Abdul Kader, whose son later became a judge of the High Court, Yusufi Abdul Kader. And, so it was a very interesting, and the school itself was a strange school. It was called Westlands. And the names of the houses were things like Raleigh, Hudson, Columbus. The only exception was Lincoln. Lincoln was the greenhouse. But, why on earth would you have this school dedicated to American historical figures? I've never been able to answer that question, and except to remind myself that the fort at the tip of the island to protect Penang was called Fort Cornwallis, and Fort Cornwallis was the last Governor General after the American War of Independence was basically involved three Georges, right? So you had King George, second or third, and then you had George Washington, and he defeated George Cornwallis. And so where else in the world does a loser get a fort named after him? But Cornwallis, not so much. I was a bit of an avid reader, and I had all kinds of things around the house. Things which I probably was confused by more than anything else. But I was reading Carl Jung, in Standard 6. Carl Jung is not something you read easily. Well, I remember sort of exploring the neighborhood, having a lot of friends around. And so some of these friends were, for example, there was a village, a Malay village nearby called Kampung Hariot. Now, what is Hariot? Okay, Hariot is actually a Scottish name, okay, as in the Heriot-Watt University, for example. And this kampung was actually named after him. It used to be, when I was a child, houses built on stilts. And every time it rained heavily, it would be flooded. We would go and catch tadpoles and all kinds of things. And sometimes eels, if there was enough water and there was a high tide in the sea, there would be eels in the drains and so on, which you came across. So that was sort of kind of an exciting kind of once I was catching chaching worms to feed aquarium fish, and the king of Thailand stopped at the traffic lights because he was on a private visit, and he looked down at me sitting in the drain. Well, he wasn't interested in me. He was interested in the fact that I had two white children among all the other Malay, Indian kids who were in the drain with me. And we had a brief conversation. And the following day, I went to the Wat, the Thai Wat in front of my house, and he was there. And he sort of recognized me from the day before, and I had a little chat with him. This is the last king of Thailand. Yes, And he was he was very amiable person and so on. Well, he happens to be the richest king in the world. A huge amount of property and so on and so forth. So and then the following day, because the king had spoken to me, and all the Thai girls were studying, came to Penang, they sort of vaguely. Every day I'd been passing some of the houses they stayed in, and I would shout things like, I only knew one term in Thai, right? Pai Nai, Pai Nai. And I would call out to these girls and so on. And they, where are you going? It doesn't mean it. But, there were lots of Thais who came to Penang to study, partly to improve their English, and in some cases also their Chinese and so on. But this girl whose house I'd been passing every day to go to school, the house happened to belong to a famous musician's mother, Jimmy Boyle, who was a well-known pianist and all that. Jimmy Boyle's mother's house, and she was staying there. So the next day after this incident, my prestige had gone up. So finally they started replying to me, and of course they replied in Thai, and of course I couldn't say anything else. My vocabulary was so limited. And 2 years later, that girl, one of the girls, was Miss Universe. The first puzzle I had, I remember in Standard 1. This is the only thing I remember about Standard 1. Of course, I remember a few friends and so on. But the puzzle I had was trying to figure out how these two brothers, who looked so different, were born in the same year to the same person. And it turned out to be they were the children of the Raja of Perlis, who there was no English language schooling in Perlis available, so he sent his sons to Penang, and they were studying in this house right next to the school, for which a special gate had been built in the barbed wire fence for them to enter. So Standard 1, 2 of them were my classmates. Yes, his younger brothers, including Tan Sri Said Anwar. And then I was causing a little bit of problems. So they pushed me to Standard 3 after that. So I skipped Standard 2. So I lost all my friends from Standard 1, and instead I had the elder brother of these two boys, who's now I can't remember his title, I think Tunku Laksmana of Perlis, Syed Raslan. And he's got a great sense of humor, and I've seen him a few decades ago. Actually, I saw him a few years ago, but he has a great sense of humor. But as I said, this school was a bit of anomalous. It didn't really quite fit into the larger scheme of things. I mean, the other schools were named like Francis Light School, Wellesley School, as in Province Wellesley, and so on and so on. But this school was, Westlands, and so on. So I just remember, as I became aware that there were other schools, I became aware about how different it was. But other than that, I cannot, Shafi Abdullah, the Najib's lawyer, was in that school a couple of years later, I think. He was in the neighborhood. So, I had all kinds of neighbors, in the larger, the further you went away from my house. I used to spend a lot of time in the field, which was called Victoria Green, where this statue of Victoria used to be, so you suddenly read the inscription at the bottom of the statue, and you suddenly realize, we are part of this empire, because she was not just Queen Victoria, she was Empress of India, right? And of course, later on, when I became much more aware of things, I began to realize how important Malaya was to the British Empire, contributing, 70% of foreign exchange earnings right after World War II for about half a decade at least. And so many of my early memories began to click because of my subsequent understanding of things. And as those things clicked, my other memories, which were less significant or didn't make sense, have receded. So I cannot say I remember all that much, but I remember little things like, walking to school and so on and so forth. Recently, I happened to go to Penang and I was looking at a tree, which was at that time a very small tree, and the tree now is huge. And it's one of these trees with lots of, what do you call this? Some people call them banyan trees, but I don't think they are really banyan trees. But, it's one of those very, very, very majestic looking trees, but it's hiding behind some kind of a fence and so on. So it's kind of sad. And then much of the neighborhood has changed, Haji Sulaiman Abdullah used to live on, I think, Immigration Road. The former Minister of Health, Subramaniam, whom I appreciated because he negotiated a deal to buy generic medicines from Egypt. The therapy for somebody who has hepatitis C, if you buy the original American drugs, it would cost somewhere in the region of 67,000 US, or about close to 300,000 ringgit per person. Yeah, just to finish the story, recently, somebody who became a friend recently was Zafrullah Chowdhury, and he passed away. But Zafrullah Chowdhury was a very significant person because he fought very hard to have this list of generic drugs, of 200 generic drugs, which would be available to everybody. Basically, you wouldn't have any IP, intellectual property, attributed to it. So those medicines are actually very useful. Unfortunately, however, now that most drugs on that list are no longer, in great demand. Some of them are still being used in many parts of the world, but most of them are not. And so there needs to be, there needs to be a rethinking of these kinds of issues. Otherwise, the promise of universal health care can never be realized if you're going to, considering the contrast. And I think the recent case of Martin Shkreli, for example, forces us to really think about, how this. I mean, Loretta Lynch, Obama's second Attorney General, did wonderful things. I mean, she was the one who went for the investigation, started the investigation of 1MDB. She prosecuted Martin Shkreli. She couldn't prosecute him for price gouging because there are no laws against price gouging. So she eventually prosecuted him for running a Ponzi scheme. But it just shows you how laws are often very inadequate to dealing with our contemporary issues. And there was something else as well, which I won't get into. But I think so. Turning now to secondary school, I went to my father's school, which was called the Penang Free School. There's nothing free about it. And it basically meant cycling a lot, which was good for me because I was putting on weight unnecessarily. And cycling to school forced me to exercise much more. So that was good. But also there was a certain egalitarianism about cycling to school, so those who were driven to school, for example, there was an obvious difference, as far as they were concerned. So free school was a very interesting experience, and Form 1 in particular I remember, maybe the novelty of going to secondary school and so on, and I became very friendly with the class teacher, Muhammad Ibrahim Nordin, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago. But he was a wonderful, wonderful teacher, and and we actually became quite friendly, which was very unusual for a Form 1 boy who to get to know and appreciate a teacher. But I remember going through school and sort of taking it with a pinch of salt. I remember one day my geography teacher was ill, so we had a substitute teacher who was the PE teacher. And he said with a completely straight face, he wasn't trying to be funny, he said, when you go up a hill or a mountain, the higher you go, the nearer you are to the sun, so it's going to be warmer. And I thought, everybody was saying that he was trying to be, humorous, but I think he actually meant it, and so we had so free school was it had a huge field, 4 football fields, which is very unusual for any school in this country, and around the school there were quarters of some teachers as well as some high civil servants. So that again was a reminder of many things for me. But cycling to that school, you would pass by a bunch of other schools. So the Methodist Boys' School was one of the schools I would cycle by. Then there was some school called Hanchang High School, which is a private school. And then you'd cycle through these roads and lanes with names which you try to make sense of, right? Like York Road. Why you call it York Road? So then you begin to think about where York is and what it implies and so on and so forth. And so it was it was that whole process of cycling, because you're cycling every day, it's quite boring, right? So you begin to think about a lot of things which you otherwise might have taken for granted if you just whisked by, by other means. And there, of course, I formed new friendships, and not many people from my primary school made it to my class in free school. But I developed this new friends, and one in particular who remains a friend to this day was a guy named Rashid Rahim, and he lived in Sungai Ara. And once another guy named Mubarak Ghani and I cycled to Sungai Araf. That was a long enough distance, but then we decided to go even further to the end of the island, to a place called Gertak Sanggol. And that was, and all this is now under threat, right, because of the current government's plans to so-called develop southern Penang and so on and so forth. Basically, it'll wipe out that. But in those days, I began to appreciate the rural community. Sometimes you'd go and if you were lucky, a durian would fall while you were around, and you couldn't pick up the durian and make away with it. But also we learned about little pools, in river systems and so on. And so it was really fun. And somebody gave me a camera, a very, very old camera, but I learned how to take photographs. And, it's really, one of those things where you open up, it's like bellows, And I remember I'd love to take photographs of all things, the water buffalo relaxing in his mud bath, and everybody, including my friend Rashid, because I was taking these photographs behind his house, and they said, what on earth, what's so interesting about this thing? But I love those photographs. If I looked for them, but unfortunately I'm not very good and we're very well organized, and I've had so many other habits, and I don't have So after Form 3, during Form 3, the other thing I did during Form 2, from Form 2, was to start taking French classes. So I would cycle to go and attend these French language classes, and I think we learned, Au Jardin de mon Pierre, Les Lilas sont fleuries. That's about the only tune I remember from those days, so I learned French, but it wasn't exactly as if I had much use for it, and so all I can do now is to, at least my pronunciation of French words is not as bad as others might be. And my daughter, who spent quite a number of years in Paris and in France, so I have more of an appreciation of what she appreciates about France compared to others, perhaps. But then I had all kinds of strange. I had a stamp collection. I had a coin collection. Nothing impressive, because I couldn't afford to buy anything. But I would collect these things. And my father, from his military days, had friends all over. So I actually had a lot of beautiful stamps, and I actually won some stamp competition and so on. But I sort of was getting a bit restless, and I joined the Scouts, which I enjoyed, but I was getting a bit restless, and one of the strange. Do you know anything about Scouting? You have to collect all these badges, right? I did a badge called Art. And I remember, I think I was still in primary school. I remember going to a neighboring school to take the test, and I had to learn Picasso, and this is a mispronunciation, Van Gogh, but it turns out to be Van Gogh. If you're speaking Dutch, or depending what language you're speaking, you pronounce the name differently. And who was the third artist? I chose 3 artists. But anyway, those are the 2 I remember, because my interest in those 2 has remained to this day. The third one I cannot remember. And we did all kinds of things, like walk through cemeteries, and pull pranks on each other, trying to frighten people and so on. That was still primary school. But later on, going into, so I then said, I heard about this thing called the Royal Military College. It just changed its name from the Federation Military College to Royal Military College. So I decided, to apply to go there, not realizing how the difficult financial straits my family was in. So they were blissfully protective. My parents were blissfully protective of me, in the sense that they never, all I knew was that I was the only kid in the class without an allowance, but I would earn money by, for example, during Vesak Day, once a year, right? All these people would come to the Buddhist temple in front of my house, and I'll collect money for looking after their bicycles. So I was a jaga, and then people playing tennis, I'll go and pick up their balls for them. I was a ball boy, and little things. And then I would go to this field, and they would play games like cricket. Okay? And I learned how to score the cricket. One of my heroes was a guy named Zainuddin Mia, who, while still in school, was already playing for Malaysia. And I remember going to the the rest of the world came to Malaysia. And this guy who was at that time living in Penang, Alex Delican, actually had a hat trick. I don't know whether you know cricket, but basically bowled out 3 people consecutively, in 3 different balls. And one of them was Gary Sobers, who was like considered to be the best all-rounder in the world at that time. And then there were all kinds of colorful characters like the Nawab of Pataudi and so on. But all that was still in secondary school. So I decided to apply to RMC and Sungai Besi, and 2 of my friends, Rashid, whom I mentioned earlier, and another guy, Jayakumar, decided to apply with me. So we all go for an interview, and we are all quite lucky. We all get in. And I think there might have been one other applicant that year, but he didn't make it. So we all arrived in RMC, but so the 2 of them didn't know each other very well, but I knew both of them. But those friendships were there were no problems, but the nature of RMC was such that didn't count very much anymore. So RMC was a very radical change in my life. I was the youngest boy in the school, which meant I had the lowest allowance, because the allowance was your allowance increased as your birthday came. So for 2 years I was the guy with the smallest allowance in the whole school, which was a real problem, because we were required to buy all these funny things like what do you call those things? School school badge for your blazer, and you had to buy a blazer which cost a bomb, at least bomb in those days, and you had to buy a school tie and all these kinds of things. So I was in debt for the first 2 years. So I learned how to cut my own hair, or get friends to cut my hair, and I would cut their hair in turn, rather than go to the military barber, because the military barber, of course, could cut your hair, but it meant that the military barber's work is quite straightforward, right? I mean, you've seen all these things about being recruited into the military and so on. So basically, zung, 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 just cutting everything here, right? And that's how what a military. So you didn't. It looked a bit too. I mean, I wasn't very militaristic, so I didn't particularly want a hairstyle like that, right? So basically, we learned how to cut each other's hair and so on and so forth. And that was a tremendous experience, because I got to know all kinds of people. Some people are historic figures right now. Well-known figures right now, like Munir Majid, Taufik Ismail was my classmate. KJ John, a whole bunch of other people. And one of the people who was a very quiet, quiet guy, but I was kind of quietly impressed with him, because he was such a serious person. And he went by the book and so on. His name was Jalil Ibrahim. And in 1983, he died. He was killed in Hong Kong while auditing the BMF scandal. So, so I developed a new sense of the world through that period. And of course, in my 3rd year in that school, I got involved. I was put in charge of like ordering magazines for the library, reading for the reading room. So I did that quite happily, because then I got to choose things, and things would come, and so on and so forth. And then after that, then by the time I got the Form 5, I even had responsibility for choosing films. So I chose some very unusual films. I remember there was one in particular. which haunts me to some, is called Morgan, a suitable case for treatment. It was basically about a challenge to psychiatry as it existed in those days, because there were a lot of people who were beginning to rethink psychiatry and things like that. So it was a very, very interesting experience, and of course the military training was not not too onerous, I didn't get into too much troubles, unlike some of my best friends who got into trouble, and the punishment was quite severe. We had some jungle training. We would go into the forest and learn how to do read, how to move in the forest, and so on and so forth. I began my first direct contacts with orang asli, which I really appreciated. I still remember crossing the Sungai Gombak, and Sungai Gombak in those days, at least, didn't look like a very threatening river, but between two rocks, when there's a torrent of water going through, it can be quite problematic, especially for those who feel insecure, they don't know how to swim, for instance. So all that was quite interesting. But after May 69, I remember we organized a blood donation campaign, and then we became the champions of almost everything in Selangor, because nobody would play with us. I remember going to a school, a Chinese school, or at least in the Chinese area, to play basketball, and the other team didn't show up on their home ground. They didn't show up when they saw our military trucks coming into the school, So it was a very, and the Chinwoo stadium was full of people who had been displaced by the fires and so on and so forth. So it was so you began to think about what causes that, why that happens, and you begin to think about why was the Alliance Party, as it was known then, so badly rejected, and so it was in a sense very important in terms of opening my eyes and forcing me to think about many things. I didn't, we were sitting in school and you could see the smoke from certain parts of and then as you read the reports, you realize that things were not what they were meant to be, and so that's when we organized the blood donation campaign. I had just turned 16 at the end of the previous year, and so I was now qualified to donate blood. You have to be 16 in those days to donate blood. So we organized this campaign and so on. And all kinds. I think, if I remember correctly, Tommy Thomas's father-in-law was the doctor at Kinrara who facilitated things, but I cannot be 100% sure about that. So anyway, when I was in lower six, a couple of things slightly extraordinary happened. Every year, the school had a tradition of having a school play, and for when I was in lower six, I was given responsibility. I went to the British Council Museum, British Council Library, and basically started looking for plays, and eventually found a play which was quite interesting. It was called Chips with Everything. And it's basically, when you think about it, it's like ordering satay and just kutupat, You go to a satay store and just order kutupat with everything, meaning the timun, the onions and all that. But you basically don't buy any meat because you cannot afford it, right? So it's basically a statement about military hierarchy. So, one of the things which is very popular these days is everybody talks about subalterns and so on. But what the play explored was that the subaltern is often the one most resented by the private. Okay, so more than the officers, and yeah, and of course when you were reading the press in those days, the Vietnam War and so on, and there was something called fragging going on. where the American soldiers were shooting their own NCOs, the non-commissioned officers, in the back, because they were bullying them and so on and so forth. So you begin to think about that. So 1967, I was in Form 4. Two things happened. You had the devaluation of the ringgit. I remember I was stuck with this Board of Currency Commissioner's money. I went to Mr. Lim's canteen, and he said, "Oh, this is only 8 ringgit 40 cents or something like that." And you're resigned to it, and then you begin to, you basically have to start thinking about, why that guy's ringgit issued by the Bank Negara was still 10 ringgit, and my 10 ringgit was only 840. And then so by the time I was in lower six, I began to think anew about these issues. And then there were reports, you read all these things, and suddenly there was this report of a guy named Ernesto Guevara getting killed in Bolivia. And you begin to think, what is the big deal about that, And so many things happen. And then suddenly in the beginning of 1968, there's the Tet Offensive. And the Vietnamese basically are reversing what they seem to be losing, according to the reports we got from the media and so on and so forth. Then suddenly they are attacking right in Saigon, and so you begin to rethink a lot of things, about how what is in the news, how we understand the news, and so on and so forth. So by the time I got to lower six, so the other two things which happened in 68, besides the Tet Offensive, of course, was the assassination of Martin Luther King, and then later Robert Fitzgerald Kennedy. And so by 69, I had this responsibility for organizing the school play. So we chose this play, which was basically, raising questions about the military hierarchy. It's not exactly the best choice of a play for a military school, and Tun Razak came. He was the defense minister. Tun Razak came, and I remember, and the play itself was, we were kids, right? We were trying all kinds of things. So we had one scene where the privates march in from the back of the hall, and they're marching in, and they are singing something very much like, which there was an African American spiritual called "We Shall Overcome." Okay, but we changed the words a little bit, and do what Tun Mahathir did to the Negaraku, speeded up the thing. So instead of "we shall," going like that, it became much faster, and it wasn't quite as spiritual anymore. But so these guys marched in, and at the end of and then after that the curtain comes down, and everybody is looking and not sure what to make of this thing, And we were saved by Tun Razak, who got up and started applauding, and of course, dutifully, all the generals got up, and so we were saved by him. This was just before May 69. Okay, so you had a sense of the larger society, but I was also feeling that doing this double maths track wasn't exactly very interesting. So I wanted to understand much more about economics. So I decided to start reading a few economics books, and enroll for the economics, for the HSC. I don't know whether you had it in your time, but there was something called the Higher School Certificate Exam, and so I enrolled for it as a private candidate, and I went to take the exams off campus at the end of 1969, and subsequently was asked to leave the school. And by that time, I had a new commandant. We had a new commandant, General Jafar On, the son of On bin Jafar. Okay, and the younger brother Hussein On, and we became very firm friends. Although, because obviously I had taken exams without permission. I hadn't been properly, and I wasn't even taking classes in economics and so on. My friends were very kind to me. They tutored me. They helped me. They lent me their books and so on and so forth. So it was. It was fun, and during that period, because of May '69, I was involved in almost every possible sport which I could pretend to be in. I wasn't a great sportsman or anything, but I was, and so I hardly went for military training during that year. So when I took the exam and all that, and coupled with the play, or what happened with the play, so and then I was selected for something called the World Youth Forum, which had previously been started by the Herald Tribune in New York way back in the 1940s. I'm not sure what that means anymore, because I'm certainly not a military officer. Yes, but a lot of people left early because, for example, some of my classmates left to go to, polytechnic. Some of them left to become airline pilots. What is now MAS, would recruit some of them. People joined the all kinds of. So our class was actually depleted by half. And the other thing about 1969 was the moon landing. So I remember this teacher of ours, he hardly taught us very much, but it was fun because we were, following the moon landing, on this miserable little transistor radio, trying to understand, and then the famous one big step for what? One big step. Yeah, and so it was a very, it was a great time to be to be growing up, right? And then I was selected also at the same time for something called the World Youth Forum. So I went to New York at the beginning of 1970, and while I was in New York, I actually went for a couple of interviews, and that helped my application prospects. So so when I left, when I went back to Sungai Besi, I was asked to leave. So I decided to go. When I went I went back to live in Penang for a while. Tried to organize some students in the sixth form, which was like trying to herd sheep. So it wasn't a very successful enterprise. And then and then I was lucky. I got a place. I got a few places, but I chose to go to Yale because at that time there were a lot of things happening in New Haven. There was a trial of a guy named Bobby Seale, and then there was a very famous strike which had taken place at Yale and so on. But nobody knew what on earth Yale was, so I had to go around saying, kunci besar tu. I did a lot of foolish things, and one of the foolish things I did was to really punch too high above my weight. So what I did was I enrolled for a lot of classes which I was not prepared for. And I remember, I was all right in mathematics, but I didn't know any statistics. So I enrolled in a class in mathematical statistics, but there were no undergraduate classes. So I took a postgraduate class in my very first semester. And there was a man who's still teaching today named Frank Hartigan. Frank Hartigan was a Glaswegian, and I could not understand what he was saying. He has
Big Scottish accent.
Not just any Scottish accent. You can Outlander is nothing compared to what this guy was, the kind of accent he had. It was really thick, and he had this very thick, big beard. He's very famous even today. And anyway, so that was good in the sense it forced me to realize that, you know, that there are limits to what you could do, you know. So I that was very humbling, and so I dropped out of that class, but which meant that I was 1 credit short, right? So after that, the next 3 semesters or so, I was just taking so many classes, so that by the time I got to my 3rd year, I had enough to graduate. And so I decided to go to graduate school, applied to graduate school and so on. And but I want to emphasize that Yale was a good place to be in because unlike my experience at Harvard, the professors were stuck. You know, you don't have an airport nearby, or at least the airport was not consequential, right? So you don't have people flying to New York or to Washington all the time, you know. Whereas at Harvard, the professors there were in such great demand, and they were traveling in and out, so you had very little face-to-face time with your professors. So I must say that at Yale, I really had I learned far more as an undergraduate at Yale than I did as a graduate student. Well, basically, I was interested in analyzing what was going on in the world, and that was an exciting time. Okay, so I started school in in 1970. In 1971, Nixon repudiates the Bretton Woods Agreement, right? He, you know, the so-called gold standard and dollar standard are no more. And then you have a system of, you know, flexible exchange rates and all and we've had that ever since then. Now, how is that supported? You know, and the whole world is basically lending to the U.S. And, you know, the system has remained for over half a century. So it began to think very much. And my hero at that point, the person whom I was the master of my college, but the reason I had chosen to go to that college was a man named Robert Triffin. And he was very insightful. He talked about what subsequently is described as the so-called Triffin paradox and so on. So I really benefited from a combination of the fact that New Haven was not a very attractive town, and people didn't travel very easily out of New Haven, and the fact that these professors were really much more accessible. And most importantly, I learned a great deal from graduate students. And from some of them, it was an exchange of favors. Because my mathematics was not bad, I would help them out with their mathematics, and they would teach me a lot of things. So I came to know later the president of Yale, who was president for a couple of decades, in fact. And we were in a study group, and I remember him saying to me, you know, in my 2nd year, I think, or maybe it was my 3rd year, he said to me, you know, there's nothing to learn in this country. Go and study in Cambridge. Of course, I didn't have the money to go and study in Cambridge, and there was no scholarship or something available, so I didn't even think about that. But so I had Kamala Harris's father became a good friend. He was visiting New Haven, and we became very good friends. And in fact, I invited him to a conference at UKM when I started teaching in I think he came in 1979. So I actually developed a range of contacts, which I was, I'm very grateful for. It was accidental. It wasn't by design, but I was just extremely lucky and so on. So I took a great interest in many things. I remember I had to read subtitles in the English language film. It was in Jamaican English, it was called The Harder They Come, and my first year I spent most of my time watching movies. And I knew almost all the early European movies, especially the Italian movies of that period and so on. But I also became acutely aware of privilege, and of course the converse, lack of privilege, right? And that was helpful, because you had all these people who would start talking, during my first year, start talking about Hobbes' other writings, and there I was struggling to understand Hobbes and why people use expressions like a Hobbesian world. And there they, these guys were telling me that, this Hobbes was contradicted himself and contradicted something else and so on and so forth. So yeah. So it was very, very. I must say I learned a great deal during that period, and I have the graduate students really to thank for it. When my father died in 1974, I had to come back and help out and start working. So I worked at and so on. Then I was lucky enough to get another very generous supplement to my scholarship, which allowed me to support my mother and my paternal grandmother. So with that I went back and went to graduate school, finished the rest. So I'd done 1 year at the MPA, which was basically a bit of a joke. But I had, finished many requirements then, and I did another year and a half, finishing, I guess what you call comprehensives. So then I came back to Malaysia at the beginning of 1976 and started work on my dissertation. And then at the beginning of 77, I joined UKM, and I worked there for 5.5 years. And then eventually, when the campus moved from its original temporary campus, moved to Bangi, and so on, after a while I decided to move on, because I was involved in other things as well, not just in the campus life. So I moved off campus and so on. And there was also a very exciting time. Mahathir came in 1981. He brought in significant policy changes. Initially, I was very keen on some of them because I saw him as a great modernizer. Later, and soon I became a bit more skeptical and critical. So I organized some discussions and debates around the Look East policy, edited a volume called The Sun Also Sets, which I don't think he particularly appreciated, and life went on from there. I think my experience at USM was actually quite. I must say that I was already teaching at Harvard when I started teaching at USM. I think the resources available at Harvard were so much superior. But in terms of the early batch of students at USM, I would say that they were as open in many ways. And some of my friends from that period are still, I still see some of them. And I would say that, if not for accident of circumstance, they could hold their own elsewhere. I think by the time I got to UKM, there was a language switch, and that language switch, I think, was problematic because there was very little. You already have inadequate materials in English. When you made the language switch, you basically had almost nothing to read, you know. So many of the early students in a place like UKM, many of them were actually fluent in English. And when I tried to introduce Indonesian language material, they resented me for it. They couldn't understand the Indonesian and so on. So and unfortunately, there was very little there was really little serious consideration at the national level, not just at the UKM level, to many of these challenges. And I think as a consequence, there has been over time a dumbing down, and I think it's a very major problem because in the sense that we do not require the students to read a lot, and more importantly, to read widely. So there is a tendency to see learning as a cumulative experience rather than as an experience in terms of challenging the mind. And this, I think, has been a major problem. I think very often the students themselves are open, but the incentives and the disincentives are there in such a way that they are deterred from it. Some of my friends and I were quite involved in an NGO called Insan, where we from 79 to 1983 we published a monthly magazine. It was mainly in Malay. It was really tough. We didn't have anybody to help us out. We were doing everything. Arranging for printing and so on and so forth. We had no resources. We were operating out of the garage of the house which I had rented. And KL being KL, it's not easy to get around. So our chairman was Nasir Hashim, who was a nutritionist from Cornell who was teaching at UKM. He lived at the other end of town. There was another colleague of ours, Rohana Arifin. She was also living in a different part of town. Others were living in places, in Serdang and so on and so forth. So it was not easy to get things, to get. I mean, it was a miracle that we published for almost 5 years. And I must confess that privately, it was a relief to get closed down. It was a relief to get closed down in the sense that, there was it was just so burdensome. But it also meant that we got engaged in a number of things. And we were constantly trying to change the discourses on a whole range of things. So, for example, Tun Mahathir was very willing to engage with us on the massacres in Sabra and Shatila camps in southern Lebanon. But he was very upset with me when I raised the question of the fact that Malaysia was one of the few developing countries in the world which actually was engaged. We had investments in South Africa when there was a boycott of South Africa going on at that time. So it was a very, although the world was increasingly black and white, it became, we were trying to introduce a range of gradations and all that to many debates, but it wasn't easy, I must say. And we were too young and too marginal to be of significance. So we were marginalized we were marginalized from the sort of Western liberal discourse, but we were also marginalized from whatever was coming about in the Malay community, because the big challenge in those at that time was the rise of Islamic discourse, and Hadi, for example, was challenging Anwar, who had joined UMNO by the early 80s, and so on and so forth. So it was a very interesting and important debates, but we were largely marginal to those debates. I'm not sure where this myth comes from. Let me be clear, okay? The whole idea of what are called capital controls, for want of a better term, is guaranteed by the IMF's Articles of Agreement. Okay, every country has the right to have capital controls. What happened was that during Tun Daim's when he was finance minister and so on, he shared the view of people like Mrs. Thatcher and Mr. Reagan to liberalize financial affairs. So you had the beginnings of what we now call financialization, which were very significant, and we had some fairly serious problems, not necessarily because of financialization, to be fair, but these problems had other origins. And one of the good things which came out of those problems was the BAFIA, the Banking and Financial Institutions Act of 1989. But by the early 1990s, it was back to business as usual. And the Troika, Tun Mahathir, Tun Daim, and Anwar, they were very keen on the promotion of the stock market and so on. So the incentives moved in that direction to enable that, and including liberalization on the capital account. Now, to be fair, because of BAFIA 1989, we didn't open up in the way that, say, Thailand opened up. And but it was, and Indonesia, of course, does not have a financial center of its own, which is basically in Singapore. So different countries in the region had problems. But the way these financial markets operate, they operate on very, very patchy information. So when the problems began in Bangkok, soon the word went around: sell, not just Thailand, sell Southeast Asia. So a country like Philippines, which had not been involved in any of the things which are going on in Thailand and Indonesia, and or for that matter in Malaysia, they were also hit at the beginning. Now, in the case of Malaysia, what happened then was that, so the financial crisis begins on the 2nd of July. Okay, so on the 1st of July, purely by chance, by coincidence, I published a book called Southeast Asia's Misunderstood Miracle. And people who had never even read the book would make statements like, "Oh, Jomo predicted the financial crisis." Okay, it was a completely, it was really, it had nothing, because that was really a criticism of the fact that the industrialization of Southeast Asia vis-a-vis Northeast Asia was compromised, which was something which later on the recognition of an East Asian miracle and all that kind of thing didn't really recognize. But this was what we were trying to argue. Now, it was an original argument nonetheless, but by the early 1990s, when the Malaysian leadership was flogging the stock market, we warned. At least I certainly did warn against that, and basically about the need to have controls. What they say is not wrong, in the sense that I call for capital account management. Capital account management is actually my invention. Okay, it's basically capital controls by a different name. So I basically call for this early on, saying that if you let the money in, that money is going to go out. Okay, it's not here because they love us, that money is going to go out, and when it goes out, it's going to cause a lot of problems. So, of course, typical thing, you prophets of doom and all this kind of thing. But eventually, that money did go out. So, in that sense, what it says is not technically wrong, but the controls I was calling for are controls on inflows, whereas what Mahathir introduced were controls on outflows, which are which was perhaps deemed to be necessary. But in my view, they were not necessary, because in 1990, the crisis starts in July 1997. It's only 14 months later, in September 1998, that you have Mahathir putting in the controls. So it's like closing the stable doors after the horses have bolted. Okay, that's how I usually put it. But the other analogy, which has to be credited to the late James Puthucheary, is that he has a very colorful thing. This is the strategy which these people adopted was like opening a bird cage and expecting more birds to fly in than to fly out. Yeah, no, for me, I supported Anwar. What was done to Anwar, in my view, was unfair, just as what happened to him in 1974 was also unfair, but those were the two occasions when he was arrested under the Internal Security Act. But he was one of many victims of the Internal Security Act, which goes back to 1960. And, there were many thousands of people who were arrested during the 1960s and so on, including Burhanuddin, who was the president of PAS, including Pak Sako, who was the chairman of the Labour Party, including Bustamam, who was the head of Parti Rakyat, and Aziz Ishak, who was an UMNO minister in the first cabinet. He was the Minister of Agriculture, but because he broke ranks after criticizing, he was also promoting cooperatives, and he broke ranks, and he was also arrested under the ISA. So, and subsequently, because of the repression against these people who represented an alternative vision of Malaysia, we have had nothing but ethno-populisms of different varieties. But going back to the disagreements with Mahathir, when I saw him last year, he was talking to a bunch of other people, and he pointed to me in jest, yeah, but he said, "Public enemy number one." Okay, that was his idea of humor, right? And so the differences which were basically policy differences. But I think it's wrong to say that I have got nothing good to say about him, because I do think that he has a view. He has a view of modernizing the country. I just think the way he wants to go about doing it is wrong-headed, and so I documented this in much of my writing. There used to be a magazine called Asia Week, and Asia Week highlighted my role in criticizing corruption from the 1980s. So this was a theme which I had been closely identified with, and I think they had a huge one full-page photograph of me and that kind of thing. Interestingly enough, they tinted it in red, so it is a very devilish picture. No, I don't know why they did that, but in any case, I had a record, and then one of my colleagues started writing on politics in business and what was called money politics. And then in Indonesia, well, first in the Philippines. In the Philippines, they started during the Marcos period, the Marcos Senior. They started something called, they opposed what was called cronyism. So that term, one of my favorite acronyms of all time is the word acronym, anti-crony movement. Okay, so when the opposition to Suharto begins in 1997, it opposes KKN, what is called KKN, chronism, korupsi, kronisma, nepotisma, because it was quite blatant what Suharto's family was doing. Now, when it came to Malaysia, the same slogan was basically introduced here, and although the circumstances are different here, I'm not saying that they were completely different, but there wasn't that kind of popular recognition of the significance of cronism, of the significance of, and the nepotism argument was, in my view, not quite comparable to Suharto. Okay, I mean, the main instance of it was probably bailing out Mirzan Mahathir and so on. So, at the, so at the end of 1998, I wrote an article for the Wall Street Journal called, and they changed the title of my article and said, Malaysia props up crony capitalists. And that became the basis, and the illustration I made was the deals which were made with Vincent Tan. And basically, Vincent Tan had not delivered on building the monorail. And firstly, in principle, I didn't believe in these kinds of swap arrangements. But he had not delivered on that, but he had retained the rights initially to what he wanted to do, which was to build linear city. So one of the consequences of making KL federal territory was that you then had federal ability to change the law. So under under English law, you have riparian land. The land on the side of a river is meant to remain in the public as public land. Okay, so you can walk, for example, on the banks of the River Thames and so on and so forth. But that was not possible with. So what that land, which was public land, was then the rights to build on that land were given to Vincent Tan. So he said that he was going to build linear city. So we already had the tallest building in the world. We were going to have the longest building in the world. I mean, it's really kind of, to me, stupid priorities. But okay, all well and good if he wants to build that. But there are all kinds of ecological consequences of using land. It's not because just the principle of it being public, because rivers change their course over time, and and so on and so forth. So this proposal of his was hugely problematic, and so he sued me for 250 million. Yes, but his whole case rested on the title. Okay, if you look at the details of the case, it rested on the title. And I was not responsible for the title. The title had been introduced by the editors of the Wall Street Journal, or maybe at least half a dozen years. So the suit began in late 1998. And so I remember going to New York to talk to the publishers of the Wall Street Journal. There was a board meeting and so on, and at the offices in the World, I can't remember what it was called. It was not the World Trade Center, the World Financial Center. It was right next to the World Trade Center, just before 9/11. So 9/11, all those buildings come down, and the World Financial Center is history. It doesn't exist anymore. But I remember going there and being quite amused by the hypocrisy of the people who ran the journal, who talked so much about virtues of competition, but they were talking about how to eliminate their main competition, which was the Financial Times, and so on. So anyway, so I was sued by Vincent Tan, and initially I was quite naive. I thought, no, I can go and just tell the truth and I would win. Unfortunately, the law doesn't work that way. Truth won't. The truth will not make you free, so to speak. And so I was advised to. So the Wall Street Journal also had a strong interest in not in keeping me tight. Okay, so they basically said we will cover the legal expenses, but basically I basically had to I was not in a position to say whatever I liked. Yusof Chin had everything to do with it because he was, who assigns which judges go to what case, right? So Yusof Chin was very friendly with Vincent Tan, and then photographs were published which showed Vincent Tan and Yusof Chin traveling, and their respective wives traveling together to Rotorua in New Zealand, to the Duomo in Milan, and also the air tickets and the hotel bookings being paid for entirely by Vincent Tan. So it became extremely embarrassing for Yusof Chin and for the entire judiciary and so on and so forth. So basically, that was the turning point. And they made, so his side made several offers to me. First, they wanted an apology. I said, nothing doing. I'm not going to apologize. Then it took almost a year before they came back with another offer. This time, the second offer was to make a joint statement. I was not interested in making a joint statement. Eventually, I think the Wall Street Journal went for that option, but they never told me. So obviously the relationship with the Wall Street Journal was very uneven. This was before Rupert Murdoch, okay? And then the third offer was to meet with him. And I said, I really don't have anything to say to him. And then when Yusof Chin stepped down as the Chief Justice of the country, I think everybody knew that it was all over. Well, we had very few dealings with each other after he became Prime Minister. But before he became Prime Minister, I did see him, and I did try to encourage a reconciliation with Anwar. But Tun Mahathir is very much his own man, and he decided what he would do, when he would do it, and so on and so forth, and the rest is well known. But so I did do that. I think in late 2016 or maybe 2017, and then it took a bit more time before I think Nurul Izzah sees him in. The story goes somewhere in the UK, and then the rest is publicly well known. I think it was a huge lost opportunity because I really benefited and appreciated the colleagues' wealth of experience and knowledge, but we were not focused enough on effective policy proposals. So for all intents and purposes, I had my own set of proposals, which never saw the light of day. I tried, for example, to scrap the GST. because the GST, although it is not progressive at all, was nonetheless a very, it accounted for a great deal of revenue which the government badly needed. So I did try to not to save the GST, but to modify the GST so it would be less onerous. But never got anywhere with that. But later on, I learned that none of my proposals, at least, got to the cabinet, and so as a consequence, I decided to. I said that as soon as the 100 days which Tun Mahathir had given us are over, we should close shop. My family appreciates its privacy, and I often have go around wearing a mask. I'm often the only person in the whole hall wearing a mask, partly to to preserve what little privacy I got married in 1986. I got married in Jakarta. The witnesses were an old friend from graduate school named Arif Budiman, who unfortunately passed away some years ago, and then another a writer, quite a well-known writer named Pramodia Anandatur. And I was married by Gus Dur. Yeah, Abdurrahman Wahid, who later became president many years later. Partly because they were old friends, and they were very keen, and I had been publishing Pramodia during the time when Pramodia was banned in his own country. In fact, technically, he's still banned, and Gusdur was an old friend also, a fairly bold thinker, original thinker. I think one of the challenges I had, and I didn't realize how difficult it was for my wife, was living in a 4-generation household. When my paternal grandmother, who died in the early 90s, was still alive when my grandchildren were born. And sorry, my children were born. So I'm her her grandson, and so she was born in 1901. Okay, and I was, and she had my father when she was 17, but she was married at the age of 14. Okay, so yeah, so so she comes from a completely different world, in a sense, and my family was very multicultural, right? Completely different cultures, religions, etc., etc. And so my wife then is Malay and Thai, okay, and she and the paternal grandmother I'm talking about was Tamil, not especially religious, but she actually could read in 2 languages, spoke 3 languages, but very much self-taught, and she spent some years of her young life before she married my grandfather, looking after cows. So it's not, and then you live in urban PJ. It's a far cry from that. My mother's side, well, on my father's side, it's more complicated than being Tamil. There are other but on my mother's side, it's so my maternal grandmother was, I think, left Swatao in Swatao.
That is where, sorry?
Swatao, Shantou.
China?
It's in Guangzhou province, okay, but it speaks a completely different dialect, okay, and the people of what is called Indochina, meaning Vietnam, Thailand, many of them are the ethnic Chinese there. So they arrive. So she arrives with her father and whatnot in Bangkok, and there is and soon after there is a typhoid or cholera epidemic. People are dying, and this is around the time of Chulalongkorn. So they basically remigrate. So they moved. She moves to Singapore, and being the least educated and so on, she she basically is married off to a cook, and then he dies when my mother was soon after my mother was born, when my mother was 5 years old. So she struggles to keep the family together and so on. And my mother makes it all the way to university only to basically drop out. Yeah, I think the most life-changing experience, especially for fathers who take fatherly responsibilities, is children. Marriage itself is not such a big deal, I think, but when children come along, that I think makes a huge difference. And so I've enjoyed being a father. I'm not sure my children necessarily appreciated much of the time I did not spend with them. Okay, so for example, because of whatever other obligations I had, I was often spending time out of the house, sometimes traveling, and I'm not sure how they felt about it. I also think they were slightly embarrassed by. I still remember one of the most telling episodes was my car running out of fuel on the slope going up in front of the old EPF building in PJ. Okay, so I was on the ramp, right, going up, and ran out of fuel. And there was a heavy rainstorm, and I got out of the car and I was pushing the car, trying to push the car. I told them not to come out, okay? But when I looked back at them, they were not just not coming out, which is fine with me, which is what I told them to do, but they were hiding so that nobody would recognize them. They were so embarrassed that my car ran out of fuel. So these are sort of episodes which I remember very fondly about them. So for me, fatherhood is a pleasant experience. The early childhood, of course, is quite interesting. I think it's later in life when they become their own personalities that becomes challenging for both parent and child. And Yeah, so it is an interesting experience to put it ambiguously. I turned 70 less than a year ago, and I faced this question for the last 65 years. You know, I mean, it's like the major preoccupation in Malaysia, and it is, in a sense, a cultural consequence of the ethno-populism in this country, which unfortunately, in my view, has become very problematic. So this ethno-populism feeds into an ethno-nationalism, and this ethno-nationalism stands in the way of a much more progressive nationalism. And this has been a major stumbling block. And we have not made progress. In fact, I would argue that we have actually regressed in very significant ways. What is his name? The poet. The paths not taken.
Robert Frost.
Robert Frost, right? I was lucky enough to be encouraged to take those paths not taken. So I've learned a great deal as a consequence. But it makes also is part of the reason I worry so much. I worry about the likelihood of war. I worry about, these are not major preoccupations of economists. Okay, so these are things which really bother me and concern me a lot. I would like to. So I do worry a lot. I do worry a lot more than I would like to. I think there's a younger generation which I think which is ready to take over the reins. I think they might benefit from listening to people who have been thinking about these issues for decades. But certainly I'm not the only one. There are many others whom we can learn from. So I do think there is much to be learned, but I think there has to be a good mix of new thinking plus experience.